So this video is going to look at different groups that opposed the Nazis, but the bottom line is there wasn't a lot of opposition in Nazi Germany, and there's a number of reasons for that. There's the argument that a lot of German people didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. For example, with the concentration camps, often they were fairly removed from the cities, and so not a lot of people could actually see firsthand what was going on. But I mean, Hitler's intentions were pretty clear, especially against the Jewish population, against expanding the German Empire, and so most people would have had an idea of the path that Hitler was heading on in terms of militarism, building up the military, and his pledge to be aggressive towards his European neighbours. So I think there is a case for that argument, but I think a lot of people had an idea. We spoke before about the idea of the guilty bystander, people that just chose not to accept or chose not to believe what was going on. But a lot of people actually liked the Nazis. Don't forget they were legitimately voted into power democratically, and there were lots of appeals, not just to unemployed people who were given work, for example, but psychologically. After World War I, German people were very bitter and embarrassed about their defeat, and Hitler, promised to come in and reverse the Treaty of Versailles and make Germany a strong country again, and so that appealed to a lot of people, having a strong, aggressive, confident leader, and a lot of people liked that in the Nazi Party and the confidence that gave them. Propaganda was all throughout all aspects of German life, and the consequences were very clear. As to what would happen if people were not, towing the line in terms of what Hitler expected them to do. And soon we're going to look at the terror state, as it became known, that Hitler sort of established to make sure he kept control of his people. But most people had fairly minor issues, in terms of their sports club might have been closed down by the Nazis, or they were forced to join, a Hitler Youth group. But there was no real coordinated effort to overthrow the Nazi Party. So when Hitler became Führer in 1934, he, set about consolidating his power and making sure that he had complete control over Nazi Germany. And so here's some aces that he had up his sleeve to achieve that end. So his SS started as his bodyguard. And they were a specialised group that were in charge of, lots of different aspects of German security, from organising concentration camps to, organising those Einsatzgruppen, the assassination squads as well, just as well as, generally being a military group that's attached to Hitler. So the SS were a very feared body, as were the Gestapo, the secret police. So there's a real culture of secrecy, people not being able to talk openly in public about their views due to these secret police and spies that were around, for fear that they could get dobbed in. There was the threat of the concentration camps. So as soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, he opened the first concentration camp for political prisoners. So people understood that if they did the wrong thing, a concentration camp was a very real consequence in Hitler's society, and the whole legal system was manipulated and rigged. As you can see in the next slide, all judges had to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler personally, and all judges had to join this Nazi league. And so Hitler, throughout those four sort of aces, he had a very, very tight control over Germany. And here's a quote: "Terror is the best political weapon because nothing drives people harder than fear of a sudden death." And that's exactly what it was. It was the fear that, if they weren't doing the right thing and supporting Hitler, any minute they could just disappear and someone would come knocking on their door. And that didn't just apply to the German people, but here, if you remember back to the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler actually assassinated several of his top SA officers, because he felt that there was a growing threat to his power. This military group was getting too strong underneath him, and so he was quite happy to also instill that culture of fear into his own Nazi party as well. And so keeping control of Germany, has lots of different angles that need to be covered. So creating the terror state through the SS and the Gestapo. Basically, as the name suggests, people were terrified to to act out, because there were some serious consequences through the propaganda that flooded German society as well. But generally, there's negative consequences for people's actions, but Hitler also, on the flip side, did his best to appeal to the people and to make them feel worthwhile and part of the new Nazi community as well, and feel united by what he was doing. So we've talked about the Holocaust, and Jews were obviously a big primary target as part of that campaign, but enemies of the state could basically be anybody that was not supporting the ideologies that Hitler was promoting. And even, as you can see here, even fraternizing with Jewish people, whether it be buying their goods or talking to them on the street, could get you publicly named and shamed, as you can see in this picture. So I guess that's guilty by association. So Heinrich Himmler here, who we've seen before in the Holocaust video, was in charge of the SS, and so he was the mastermind behind instituting the Holocaust, and the Einsatzgruppen and the ghettos, etc. And so he was ruthless when he was hunting down what was known as the enemies of the state. And here's a flowchart that just shows about how this terror state impacts an individual on an everyday level. So as you go through that, you can see what life was like, for someone who was a suspect or was being chased by the Gestapo. So now we're looking more at specific groups that opposed the Nazi regime. The Nazis had a lot of support. They, as you can see in the second point there, in the Reichstag election, when they got democratically voted in, they achieved around 45% of the vote. But that still means that there's about 55% of Germans that didn't support Hitler and that didn't vote for him. And so there was a lot of political opposition all throughout. So a lot of Hitler's early opponents were, I guess, communists. The Nazi Party and the Communist Party were the two groups that sort of came to fill that void when the Great Depression hit. They were those two extreme groups that people looked to provide some radical changes in Germany. And so I guess Hitler saw the communists as his mortal enemy. That was his main threat in terms of politics. But next we're going to look at some specific groups that I guess, and individuals that spoke out and I guess tried to create a sort of a counterculture running against the rigidity and the strictness of the Hitler Youth and other groups like that. So in general, young people hate being told what to do, and there was a lot of young people, despite the dangers, that acted out against the things like the compulsory Hitler Youth and the education system that was flooding them with Nazi propaganda. And so there were certain gangs of young people, as we'll see in a minute, that took it upon themselves to speak out. So one of those is the White Rose movement, which was a university movement among young students, and they were, I guess they were giving out anti-Nazi pamphlets and leaflets, and it was a secret society that started forming amongst students. And this movement was caught onto by the Gestapo, and some of their leaders, Hans and Sophie Scholl, were caught and executed by the Gestapo. But that's the White Rose movement. The Edelweiss Pirates as well was another youth movement, and that's probably the best way to describe it. It's more of a movement, I guess an intellectual movement of young people, not a specific group in a specific place, but this is the umbrella term given to lots of little gangs, I guess, of young people that refused to go to Hitler Youth and would spend their time, roaming the countryside and causing trouble instead of, going to the Hitler Youth camps and rallies. So this is, I guess, what you'd call counterculture. They were trying to create their own protest movement. They didn't like the conformity of wearing the uniforms and having to do the strict, daily routines that most German teenagers had to do. And they liked to, they like to listen to jazz music and wear sort of British, Western European fashion and things like that. And so these youth groups weren't initially a major concern for Hitler, because they were just sort of seen as a pest, and sort of they had bigger things to worry about. But as World War II sort of came around, these people were seen as a lot more dangerous because they could potentially be spies, and it would cause them a lot more sort of security concerns at home. Members of the church a lot of them were outspoken opponents of Hitler because of how Hitler tried to Nazify the church and I guess merge lots of Nazi ideologies with traditional Protestant practices. And so, lots of Bible groups, youth, church youth groups were all infiltrated and monitored very carefully as to the messages that they were giving their followers, just like schools were under the education system. This is a famous individual, Martin Niemöller, who was a Protestant minister who ended up in the concentration camps for speaking out against that same issue, the Nazification, the pollution of the Protestant church, especially the Nazi ideas of race and superior Aryan, Hitler creating that racial masterclass. So that was something that obviously doesn't fit in with Christian ideals, and that was something that Niemöller spoke out against. And he wrote a famous poem here about the prejudice involved with the Holocaust as well, that we'll study more in class. Paul Schneider was another pastor who actually died this time in the concentration camps. Again, he could not accept and wouldn't accept the German Christian movement, the blend and fusion between Nazism and Christianity, and he was actually an ongoing opponent. He was jailed several times throughout the 1930s until he was finally executed. And Cardinal Galen was another individual who spoke out this time against the Nazis' use of euthanasia against disabled people in concentration camps. And again, this is a highly controversial concept, and he spoke out very publicly against the mercy killings of these undesirable groups, as Hitler called them. And he was a difficult target for the Nazis because he was a high-ranking religious official, obviously, and they were very worried about what would happen if they executed him. And so he actually lasted, throughout the Nazi regime, but lots of his followers and other pastors actually were executed. And one of the most famous direct attempts on Hitler's life personally was the July bomb plot in 1944. So there were lots of Nazi army generals who, could see that the war effort was going downhill very quickly in the second half of World War II, and Hitler was getting more and more erratic with his decision making, and so they thought that they would take it upon themselves to assassinate Hitler for the good of Germany. So they launched Operation Valkyrie, as it was called. There's also a Hollywood film based on this, by placing 2 bombs in a briefcase and putting it into the meeting room where Hitler was meeting with his top Nazi officials. The bomb went off and the room exploded. However, Hitler was only injured in a small way, just minor burns, etc. And there was a small window where they could have possibly revolted, all of the Nazis, against Hitler in that moment of weakness, but in the end Hitler took his revenge by executing over 5,000 people that were implicated in supporting that July bomb plot. So that was one of the most famous direct attempts at taking out Hitler, and here you can see the destruction caused by that bomb. And so in terms of opposition and support for the Nazi Party, most people assumed that everybody living in Germany was automatically a Nazi, but that wasn't true. When Hitler first came to power in 1933, only about 2% of the German population identified as being Nazi members, and by the end of World War II, only about 10% at the maximum were Nazi Party members. So, even though lots of people didn't directly support the party. They were trapped in this terror state that Hitler had created.